While Al-Biruni also discredited the idea of some castes being impure, and what he noticed besides the fact that this kind of segregation was not unique to India, he also noticed that these castes were not socially segregated. They lived in the same cities, they visited the same marketplaces, so their social life was not segregated in the sense that some of them were untouchable or something like that. Now, about the caste system itself, it probably wouldn't have been an oppressive system um, in the sense that it has been portrayed. Now, this is one of the things about history of a lot of places. Their history is portrayed in a very Orientalist sort of, through a very Orientalist sort of lens. Now, think about modern free democracies today. What percentage of people ever get to have jobs they dreamt of having as children? 96% of people end up having jobs they did not want as children. Does it really matter if those people instead work a job which their parents had established a business in? In fact, having your parents established a business, um, you know, in a certain profession probably helps you get recognition more. As a cobbler or as, let's say, someone who tans leather. If your parents did the same thing, you have a reputation. Your family has a reputation, and honestly, also genetics also plays a role. If your parents were good at something, then you're probably also going to be good at something similar. You're not going to fall very far away from the tree either. Some cultures realize this a lot more than others, instead of giving their people the illusion of free choice. Now, of course, it can be argued that 4% of people could have done something else. Now, which is true, but 96% of people would probably do better in a system where their parents already have an established business, where their parents are already recognized for doing something in particular and carrying on with that job. Now, another thing to consider is, while the non-Brahmin castes were not allowed to have an education, have a formal education, you did not require a formal education in Indian civilization for a lot of stuff. You could just you could just take up the job, and they'll just teach you firsthand. It would be practical, right? Um, the problem was when the British came along and they established their education system. With the Western education system, the problem is, to fix a road, you need a degree. And when you have a civilization where only certain people are allowed to have education, and that education system from the West is imposed on that country, then essentially what happens is Brahmins would have the monopoly over every single job. So, what the caste system used to be before was the Brahmins were given social hierarchy, given the social top spot, but there were a lot of restrictions which Brahmins had when it came to what they could trade what they could trade with, the amount of money they could have. So they had the social upper hand, but they did not have the upper hand. They had a disadvantage when it came to economics. The caste system was not this system of equality. It realized that different people have different capacities, and apples don't really fall far. Apples don't really fall far from the tree. So, of course, for centuries it was not oppressive. But when it was kind of mandatory that you need to have an education for all of these jobs, which the non-Brahmin castes had, that would be the time it became oppressive. Because if you now still stop those people from getting an education, those people simply wouldn't even have jobs. But without that, without the requirement of formal education, the caste system was perfectly all right. Also, what I'm trying to get across here is, if the caste system was so horrible, then India probably wouldn't even survive as a civilization for so long. So, if lower caste people, quote unquote lower caste people, were oppressed and had no advantages at all, you simply wouldn't see India exist without constantly falling into wars and social unrest. That was actually pretty uncommon. In fact, empires went to war, and people were rather loyal to their kings. Do you think people would have done that if they were constantly oppressed? I fail to think so. They were not any more oppressed than people were at any point of time. Also, there's an account of historian Dharmaswamy from Tibet in the late 12th century, if I recall correctly. He recounts how he was offered to be the court Brahmin of Mithila, even though he was a Buddhist, even though he was a foreigner, by a Hindu king. So when people talk about how there was Hindu-Buddhist conflict in ancient India, they don't mention this contemporary sources. They mention some mythical account of what happened 300 years after it supposedly happened. Stuff like Ashokavadana, which recounts mythical stories. And it was probably written by some biased ass bitch as well. Lower caste people were not really oppressed. They had equitable lives, though not the illusion of equality. It's truly not possible to have equality if people have different strengths. That's the first mistake a lot of societies tend to make. And there was a conflict between the Buddhists and the Hindus. And the interesting thing is, there's a lot of congruency between Hindu and Buddhist philosophy. There's also a lot of congruency between some Hindu sects and Sikhism. In the Dasham Granth of Sikhism, the 10th chapter of the Sikh holy book, there's actually hymns dedicated to Hindu goddess Durga and Chandi. The funny part is, if this was any other part of the world, you would probably consider these two people the same people. These two people to be the same religion and different branches of the same religion. Let's say you had two people. Let's say you have two groups. Both think Jesus is the Son of God, but one thinks church should have more rights to govern people's lives, and the other doesn't think that should be the case. They would still be both considered Christians, but the funny part is, people don't do the same thing with Hindus. They consider Sikhism to be a different religion. And while it's true that the idea of Hindu did not exist and there were divisions between the Vaishnavites and the Shakts and the Shaivites, if you look into Vishnu Puran, if you look into Shiva Puran, if you look into Brahma Puran, none of these Puranas actually discredit Vishnu as not being a true god. Let's say the Shiva Puran, it does not discredit Vishnu as being a false god. It simply thinks that Shiva is the higher deity. Same with the Vishnu Puran. It doesn't consider Shiva to not be a god, it simply considers him to be a lower deity compared to him. And it's the same with the Brahma Puran. They don't consider the other two to be false gods, like Abrahamic religions would consider with other religions, but they consider them to be slightly lesser deities. There was no major war between these people. So when you say, oh, these were different groups, you have to understand that that is simply not true. They had minor disagreements among each other. They had debates between their scholars. There's tons upon tons of books written about this. And there's actually a very interesting temple inscription from southern India about what Indians generally felt about each other, what Indians generally felt about the idea of God. The inscription goes something like this. To the Vaishnavites you are Vishnu, to the Shaivites you are Shiva, to the Buddhists you are Buddha, to the Jains you are Jinnah, and to the atheists you are the supreme truth. Now the thing is, I can be proud of this as an Indian without getting too far ahead of myself, right? Like claiming, sir, there were super powered nukes in India, sir, in the past, sir. I'm not going to claim that. That's not true. That is a fantasy cooked up by the right wing. But what I also wouldn't take is people claiming that this idea of Hinduism was created by Gandhi in the 20th century. That's not true. That is simply not true. The people of India lived in relative harmony among one another for centuries, for millennia. And they did not discredit slightly different beliefs among each other. In any other part of the world, that level of difference in belief, would have caused a 30 years war with 10, 20 million people dying. In China, some guy would claim to be the second Jesus Christ and there would be 100 million people dead. That's quite literally what happened. There was a 30 years war in Europe. You simply cannot point out one example as such from India. If there was not an unified identity of religion, then there would have been a lot more wars. If there was a split identity, like it was between the Protestants and the Catholics, you'd probably see a lot more wars. If there were people constantly claiming to be some messiah, then you'd see something like that weird event in China where 100 million people died for quite literally nothing. What do you see instead? You do not see all of that stuff happening. You see the different castes worship the same deities. You would even see that groups which are called different religions also worship the same deities. The Sikhs quite literally had hymns dedicated to Durga and Chandi. This is the kind of self-hate that you see from a lot of Indian historians on the left wing. You don't have to be a lunatic who thinks that there were super-powered spacecraft or nukes in ancient India to love your country, to appreciate something good about it. Every culture has something that it can claim that it was better at than other cultures. And cultural cohabitation, tolerating each other, that is probably something Indians were better at than a lot of other places. Indians did not consider the Huns barbarians. The Hun king Mirkula, he literally converted to Hinduism. The UAZ, they had their kings convert to Buddhism, and Shaivism. You cannot bring out a similar example of invaders of Rome converting to Christianity, because Christianity was simply never such an accepting and loving religion to begin with. The truth is, Rome was probably better when it was a non-Christian nation. Rome was better when it was pagan. Rome made its advances when it was pagan. Get this straight in your head. And Europe only managed to get ahead when it realized that retardedness of Abrahamic religion wasn't going to cut it. When they tried to bring back the glory days of Greece and Rome, that's when they really got ahead. That's when they really expanded their empire. They might have claimed Christianity was the driving force back then, but the truth is, there is nothing Christian about the modern West. There is nothing Christian or Judeo-Christian about the development that the West went through. It was thoroughly secular and an attempt to bring back the glory days of the pagan past. Christianity quite literally shoved Europe in its dark ages. Christianity is not a religion which has civilized Europe, or for that matter any single civilization. I'm not going to claim that there has been a direct role of religion in shaping India either, or developments in India either, but generally when you have more tolerant religious groups, debate can happen. You as a society can progress. The caste system was not something that was oppressing the non-Brahmins. It also placed restrictions on the Brahmins, what they could trade, how much money they could have. That's the point, guys. You have people like these talking shit about India all the time in ways that India doesn't deserve to be criticized. Indian history doesn't deserve to be criticized. The present of India does. India is a shithole today. That deserves criticism. Every sort of wrong management deserves criticism, but you don't have to be a right-leaning lunatic to understand that a common identity among Indians, even through different empires, existed. Sometimes you would quite literally have three empires fighting each other for a single deity. for a single idol. In fact, I don't remember exactly which three dynasties those were. I would post it in the community post. They actually fought each other. These were three different empires which fought for a single idol. They fought for a single statue for it to be established in their own dominion. While these were divided by empires, they were unified by their faith. They were unified. They were divided by regions. They were unified by their faith for that same deity. To say that India did not have a common identity of religion, it's just bullshit. It may not have been called by the name of Hinduism. The Hinduism term is an exonym. In fact, simply grouping Shaivism, Vaishnavism, and Shaktism as Hinduism, and Sikhism as something outside of that, Buddhism as something outside of that, Jainism as something outside of that, is malicious. I would argue all of these five have the same cultural identity. The last monk of one of the greatest Buddhist universities throughout human history was taken care of by Brahmins. The Nalanda University, after it was ravaged by Turks, the last monks of that university were taken care of by Brahmins. So when people cook up stories of Hindu-Buddhist conflict, they are majorly just shitting on you. That Dharmaswami guy visited to India, that historian, he was offered to be the court Brahmin by the king of Mithila. Like, get this through your head. These people have no idea. They just point to semi-mythical texts and tell you all of this stuff. Never take these people seriously. The kind of people you see talking about Indian history on the internet are lunatics on both sides. This is important because it's a country which is at a flashpoint. If it doesn't deal with its history neutrally, take the good for what it is and take the bad for what it is, it's never going to move past where it is right now. It can be a great country, but with these people, it's probably never going to turn the can into will.